Welcome everyone. If you're rolling into the webinar, welcome to Shaping the Future of Food with IATP. We're happy to have you here. So a little bit about IATP. If any of you are new, at our core, we work to create sustainable food and agriculture systems. And I'll just go into a little bit further detail. So IATP, as most of you know, but some of you are new to, we are a research and policy organization. We work at the crux of local work and international policy perspective and everything in between to try to get a better sense of the landscape of agriculture and food system policy and how we can make it more sustainable. We lift up the voices of smaller and mid-sized producers and produce original research to showcase changes we can make to making a more sustainable future of food. So with that, y'all, there's of course more to be said about IATP and what all we do, but I am really excited to hand over the discussion to my colleague Leila, and we're just so ready for you. So Leila, I'm gonna let you take the reins here.
Great. Thanks so much, Colin. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm just going to put up my slides to share with you today. And while those load, I will just say, my name's Leila Yao. I'm the Climate Program Associate here at IATP. Let me go to the top here. I'm the Climate Program Associate here at IATP, and today we'll be discussing my work tracking climate-related disclosure rules and their impact on major meat and dairy companies. And plus, I'll also be demonstrating the tool that we've been developing here at IATP based on this work, which we like to call the Meat and Dairy Emissions Dashboard. So to start at the top, climate disclosure rules are laws that require companies that meet certain size and revenue thresholds to report on GHG emissions, climate-related risk information, and the measures taken by the company in response. Climate-related disclosure rules have been introduced in over a dozen countries, and they've been estimated to impact about half of the global economy. Climate-related disclosure rules are based on frameworks from the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, TCFD, the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB, and also the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And because these rules are based on these standardized and sort of widely adopted frameworks, there is broad agreement between rules in terms of what they require from companies and also how that information should be reported. However, rules do vary by jurisdiction, and some rules are stronger than others. The strongest rules have been implemented in the EU with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD, and in California with the Climate Accountability Acts. And these rules currently require full scope emissions reporting, which includes emissions occurring in a company's supply chain or scope 3 emissions, for both public and private companies, with third-party verification, among other details. Climate-related disclosure rules are important because they basically serve two key purposes that we'll talk about today. So first, they help investors make better investment decisions. And also, importantly, they help hold companies accountable for their climate impact. So to start with the first one, climate change poses imminent risks to businesses and investors, which take the form of physical risks and transition risks. So physical risks are financial losses from climate disasters, resulting, and also the resulting supply chain disruption from those disasters. And as we experience bigger and more costly climate disasters, the physical risks to businesses and investors are going up. Transition risks are financial losses borne by carbon-intensive industries during the transition to a low-carbon economy. So transition risks include changes in the regulatory environment, maybe tech innovation, or shifts in consumer demand that make carbon-intensive goods less profitable. And because climate change poses these risks to businesses, it's important for investors to have the full picture about a company's exposure to climate risk. And that's exactly what these climate-related disclosure rules are designed to do. Disclosure rules also help hold companies accountable for their climate impact. And they do this by making climate-related reporting standardized and accessible, not only for investors, but also for the public. Companies' voluntary reporting is often misleading or unreliable and hard to compare between companies or across sectors. And actually, the food and agriculture sector has ranked the worst of all the non-financial sectors for the quality of their voluntary climate disclosure in 2020. So there's a clear need to create a mandatory standardized reporting regime around corporate climate disclosures so that investors and also the public can be sure that they're getting accurate, high quality information about the climate risk that companies are exposed to. And by providing information on corporate climate impact, disclosure rules are also a concrete step toward actually reducing emissions in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Some of the stronger and wider reaching climate-related disclosure rules have faced legal and political challenges. So in the US, the SEC has abandoned its defense of the rule, and there is really no future for the rule under the Trump administration and Paul Atkins' future leadership as the SEC chair. Just to note, Atkins hasn't actually gone through confirmation yet, but he is qualified and he's well loved by the tech and the crypto lobby. So he's almost certain to be confirmed, and his confirmation has been rumored to be soon. In the European Union, facing pressure from right-leaning governments, an omnibus legislation package, which was aimed at simplifying the already existing sustainability and ESG regulations, has been announced, and it could be voted on in the next few months. The simplification package waters down some of the aspects of the CSRD, and it decreases the number of firms that would be affected by the directive while maintaining other key aspects of the rule. It's not clear if the simplified omnibus bill will pass, and until it does, the old CSRD is in full force, still effective, and companies do have to report under it. In California, a legal challenge against the rule on First Amendment grounds has so far been unsuccessful. The comment period to inform implementation of the rule does close tomorrow, and IATP has submitted a comment to show our support for strong disclosure rules in California, as well as joining with our partners on an additional comment to show the same. So there is some regulatory uncertainty, given the legal and the political challenges to some of these rules, but there's also reason to keep pushing for these rules and planning for their eventual implementation. And that's because companies have already invested resources into preparing to report. And companies do see climate-related disclosure rules as something that will eventually be required. So large companies that know that they'll have to report under at least one climate-related disclosure rule are using this time to internally coordinate and to prepare to report in the future. Second, some companies are already reporting this information in other ways. And so disclosure rules are not overly burdensome, but rather they provide some standardization and some clarity for businesses and investors and the public alike. And finally, investors want this climate risk information. There was a study done by MSCI in 2024 that concluded that investors are increasingly making investment decisions based on climate risk. And so companies that want to continue to be competitive will need to provide it. So despite the legal and the political challenges, it's looking like disclosure rules are gaining momentum, and the global scope of these rules is increasing. And they will be important levers for accountability, for corporate accountability moving forward. And so that's sort of background on the rules. But at IATP, we wanted to know how these rules will impact, or already are impacting, major meat and dairy companies. And we want to focus on meat and dairy companies because of their outsized climate impact and their particularly lax voluntary reporting, which IATP has written on extensively through our Emissions Impossible series and other articles that you can check out on our website. So to understand how meat and dairy companies are affected by the global rules, we set out collecting a lot of data from various sources. And we decided that actually the compilation of that data is part of the value add that IATP can bring to the table on this topic. And so we are in the process of creating what we're calling the Meat and Dairy Emissions Dashboard, which will be an open source, interactive, regularly updated database that will live on the IATP website. And the dashboard is still being developed, as I mentioned, but I'm going to give you a sneak peek today at some of the data behind the dashboard and what kinds of data visualizations we can achieve with it. So I'll just click in here. And it may take a second to load, but so again, this isn't the actual dashboard. I just want to stress that, but it can show us what kinds of things the dashboard will be able to do. So first off, we can view a map of global climate-related disclosure rules and information about the rules. So, if you click in, you can hover on any jurisdiction that has a rule, and you can read sort of the SparkNotes version of what that rule covers. So we can click on the US to look at, oops, if it'll allow me to. Little bit slow, a little bit of lag over here, but you can click in and hover over any of these jurisdictions to look at the different rules and what they entail. And then if you scroll down, which a little bit of a technical difficulty over here scrolling. Here we go. Got to use the bar apparently when you're working with these data visualizations. But when you scroll down, you can look at the table. So if you need more information about the climate-related disclosure rules, including links to the legal text of the rules or detailed information about what is required, you can access this table or something similar on the dashboard with 2 pages of information about the rules and about information about which major meat and dairy companies will fall under the rules. So you can see all the links to the different rules, the legal texts. You can look at, like I said, 2 different pages of information. We've got lots of different information in there for you to sort through and filter through. You can also search in this table. So as there are more rules, we'll continue to update these things. And you can search to find exactly the rule that you're looking for and all the information that we have about it, as well as a link to it so that you can go find out more for yourself. If you still need more information about how the rules impact specifically meat and dairy companies, you can interact with this network graph or one similar on the dashboard to explore how global rules create broad coverage, a network of coverage of meat and dairy companies. So again, you can interact directly with this data. You can hover over any company and look at the rules that it will have to report under. You can do the same for the jurisdictions and look at how these different jurisdictions impact or cover different companies. You can also, if you just want to look at dairy companies, you can just do that. If you just want to look at meat companies. So there's a lot of fun to have playing around with that visualization. But maybe you need more specific information about just one of the jurisdictions. And so if that's true, you can look at a network graph for each individual jurisdiction. And so here's an example of which companies are affected by the California rule. And also we get a little bit more granular here. So we can look at what level they're affected. So whether they're affected at the subsidiary level or at the parent level, meaning that the company would have to report this information for all of their subsidiaries. So we can click in and we can see that JBS is likely to report under the California rule at the parent level, subsidiary level for Le Groupe Lactalis, and so on. So you can sort of play around with this. You can move it around to sort of match how you want it to look. And again, you can just sort by just meat or just dairy. Maybe you need, though, instead of this more granular information, maybe you need some information on the big picture, information about meat and dairy companies' emissions for the last few years. And you can access that on the dashboard too. So you can filter and sort in a graph that looks similar to this one on the dashboard so that you can see, right now we're looking at all companies and all emissions data. We've also included IATP estimated emissions as part of our emissions impossible methane edition. Again, it's linked here. You can click into that. But so we can also sort just by a particular company. So let's say we're just curious about Tyson, or maybe we're just curious about who would actually have, let's look at Nestle perhaps, curious about their emissions, so on, so forth. You can also sort by the year, or maybe we're just interested in the IATP estimated emissions from our previous report. So that's how you can sort of see the big picture about the impact of these meat and dairy emissions. And then finally, lastly, for today's demonstration anyway, if you want to double check information in this dashboard, or if you want to read the company's reports for yourself that some of this information comes from, you can do that in the searchable database. So let's say I just want to look at Tyson. You can search Tyson, and then we're going to be able to provide on the dashboard links to their annual reports and their sustainability reports. So right now we just have 2023, but we'll be updating this dashboard periodically. And so we'll have all of their reports available so that people can go in and sort of click in and find out for themselves if they just want to read more, if they want to know exactly what was said about climate risk in 2023 in Tyson's sustainability report. You can do the same for any other company, or you can just scroll through all of them and see what you find and explore. So that's briefly, very briefly, a rundown of what kinds of things the dashboard will be able to do for us, what kinds of questions the dashboard will be able to answer. Again, the dashboard eventually will be housed on the IATP website, and it'll look a bit different from this, but that gives you a sense. So we'll just click back into here, and I'll just start to wrap up our conversation on the disclosure rules in the dashboard just by informing you that the tentative launch date for the dashboard is coming up in May. And it'll be updated periodically thereafter so that it'll provide the most up-to-date information possible on disclosure of these meat and dairy companies and meat and dairy emissions. So you can reach out to me at this email on the screen with any feedback or questions that you have about the dashboard. You can also reach out to Colin at the end of this webinar with any feedback for him, and he can pass it along to me. So with that, I believe we'll transition to the Q&A portion, and I'm looking forward to answering everyone's questions and to digging a little deeper into the rules and also the impact on meat and dairy companies. So thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Leila. This was excellent. If you want to stop sharing, we'll go right to us. Thank you, folks. I will just acknowledge Leila when she said it is a abbreviated summary of what she's been doing and working on. This has been months of work to put together all this material, and this is certainly just the abbreviated version. So there's a lot more depth we can go into. And with that, Leila, we'll answer and get into a few of these questions. I've got a couple right away. So I was curious, like, of the features that you demonstrated, what are currently available features for people to use? And where might we find those? Like, is that dashboard available? Or I know you've got some reports as well that people can interact with some of these materials.
Absolutely. So the dashboard, like I mentioned, won't be fully available until May, but we have already started to put out some of this data and this information, and we've already started to visualize it in some of the ways that I just showed you. So if you go to IATP's website and you look at our latest work and find any article that we've written about climate-related disclosure rules, there are 3 now. So you can go into any of those 3 articles and sort of explore on the map or look at the table of how meat and dairy companies are impacted by these rules and interact with that data yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Leila. Antonio was wondering, how do we build the emissions estimations? I believe he's referring to some of the emissions impossible estimations that were provided. I understand that's a little bit out of your purview, but do you mind commenting on the emissions estimations?
Yeah, sure. So that's part of our work that we did with Emissions Impossible. It's a series that we did a few years back. And those estimations of methane emissions and total emissions by meat and dairy companies were done in alignment with the FAO's sort of recommendations on the methodology for that. And so for a full explanation, I would definitely direct you to the reports. So again, IATP's website, look up the Emissions Impossible reports, and you can find all the information that you need about exactly how those estimates were come across and how we use them.
Cool. Thanks, Leila. I'll be sure to link some of those in the follow-up material that I send out following the webinar. Another question here is about kind of this relationship between carbon offsets and disclosures. Do you have any perspective on how these disclosure rules might affect the buying and selling of carbon offset programs?
Well, I will say that in the disclosure space, so some of these disclosure rules do require that offsets are reported separately from emissions, and other rules do not. And of course, the stronger rules, the rules that we push for, do require the separate reporting of offsets from other emissions, because we think that it's really important that those are reported separately to get the full picture of a company's climate impact. In terms of how it will affect the market for offsets, I'm not sure that I'm the most qualified person to answer that question. I think that that's a really interesting question and something that we can continue to look at moving forward. I think it's possible that it affects the market. I also think that it might not, but I do know that we really push for these stronger rules that require the separate reporting of offsets because we think that that's really important.
Yeah, I will double down and say I think this is a really good question about carbon offsets in general, and perhaps something for IATP to cover in a future program is just like general commentary and kind of the landscape of it, because it is fairly complex. But thank you for that question, Donald. Leila, a question for me as someone who's not in the depths of this as much. You've mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting. I'm sure some of y'all in the attendance might be familiar with that, but I'm betting some of us, including myself, don't quite get the full span of that. Do you mind giving a brief overview of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and why scope 3 emissions are so important?
Of course, yeah. So that is really important for understanding these rules, understanding the difference between scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1 emissions are direct greenhouse gas emissions from sources a company owns or controls, whereas scope 2 emissions are indirect GHG emissions from, like, for example, purchased energy, like electricity, for the company's operations. And scope 3 is the full supply chain emissions of a company. And so we know that for food and agriculture companies specifically, 90% of their total emissions are scope 3. And so we really need to see scope 3 emissions reported by these companies in order to get an accurate picture of their full climate impact. And so some companies already report scope 3 voluntarily. They already put it into their sustainability or annual reports, and other companies don't report even scope 1 or scope 2. And so there's just a wide range of approaches there. And when they do report scope 3, sometimes it's not verified. Sometimes we don't know how much to trust that information. A lot of times it's presented in sort of a misleading way in order to lower the way that it seems that the company is impacting the climate. So that's part of what makes these disclosure rules so important, is that it standardizes that process for reporting scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 for all companies across all sectors. And we know that that's especially important, as I said, in food and ag.
Yeah, thanks, Leila. We've had some questions in the chat about enforcement of these disclosures and regulations. Can you comment at all about like what there might be within this larger framework around enforcement of, I mean, there's enforcement of reporting, but presumably down the road, some enforcement of like landing within certain range that has been deemed appropriate. I know right now we're kind of just talking about reporting, but I suppose, yeah, if you don't mind commenting about what might exist in the enforcement landscape of these reporting regulations.
Sure. Yeah. So enforcement that's an interesting thing to bring up. I appreciate those questions. So some of these rules have really specific language around enforcement written into the rule, and other rules don't include any language on enforcement. But all of them are put forward by financial regulators that theoretically have the full weight of enforcement of the regulatory body behind these rules. And so in terms of enforcement, yeah, I guess it's a little bit of like a murky territory to think about how that might look in the future. But I think that an important thing to remember is that that's kind of what an NGO's role, or like this dashboard's role and the public's role in this process might be. Part of that might be providing some accountability and some oversight into this process and being able to call out companies that maybe are not reporting in alignment with these rules that they fall under, even if the financial regulators are not so quick to do that themselves. But I do think that long term, the full weight of these financial regulators is behind, the full enforcement weight of these regulators is behind the rules. And so long term, I think that we can expect some enforcement. But I think that's a great point. And I think that the dashboard, in one sense, can maybe provide some clarity on this or provide some accountability on that in the meantime, in the short to medium term.
Yeah, thanks. I think that rolls right into this next question, which someone posed about how are you hoping to use the dashboard, or how do you hope it's used once it's officially launched? You touched on it, but if you don't mind extrapolating on that.
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple specific user groups in mind that we are designing the dashboard specifically for. Of course, anybody can use the dashboard, and we hope that they do. But so specifically, we're thinking that policymakers can find the dashboard very useful. You know, if policymakers are curious about the effects of these rules, if they're saying, well, you know, how many meat and dairy companies in our case, we're actually starting to report under these rules, and how effective is that reporting? They can go into the dashboard and find that information pretty quickly, given the data that we're providing. So policymakers is one group of people that we're interested in reaching. We're also interested in reaching researchers and journalists, people that, you know, put out research on this topic that are just, you know, they need like a hub for all of this data. Because I mentioned that this data, it's all open source, it's all available to the public. And yet it's kind of hard to find. And it's in so many different sources. It's like these disparate sources of information. So pulling all of that together, creating a hub for this could be really helpful for researchers and journalists. And so we really want to reach those people as well. And finally, investors. I mean, investors have a lot of the information about financial risk to companies. They have all of the financial information and the company level information that we provide in the dashboard, but they might not have the level of insight about the big picture, the climate impacts, the emissions data, things like that, that could be so useful for investors moving forward. As I mentioned in the presentation, investors are increasingly interested in that data, and they're increasingly making decisions based on that data. And so I think that investors is another user group that we are specifically hoping to reach.
Yeah, sounds like quite the range of folks that might use this, and that it may end up being impactful in the regulation kind of options down the road of how we, and enforcement, that these folks can actually look at it and say, okay, what is happening? So I think that's really exciting opportunity with the dashboard. We've had Charles raise a question here in the chat, I think touching on scope 3 stuff. I'll read it aloud and then allow you to comment. If you need to pick it apart, we can. But we've got emissions from companies processing livestock products must stretch back into supply chain that is complicated and should include agricultural inputs, methods of pasture sources, and especially feedlot sources. Are you confident that these are adequately measured? And if you want to comment, it sounds like we're considering some like verification in this as well. So from that question and some considerations around third-party verification, go for it, Leila.
Sure. Well, we can take that in two directions. So I think the first part is measuring scope 3 emissions. And so just to keep it in the realm of the disclosure rules, there's a lot of ways that we can talk about the different standards and frameworks that exist for doing that. To keep it in the realm of the disclosure rules, that is something about the rules that is nice, is that there are these standards and frameworks that have been widely agreed upon, that are widely used already, that have a specific way of measuring scope 3. And so to the extent that these rules and standards are followed, we can be sure that scope 3 is measured in that way. But to your point about whether that's the best way to measure scope 3, that's a great question and a great topic of conversation too, around the measuring of scope 3. But to the other part of that question about sort of verification and that process behind the disclosure rules, and if we can trust the information that is being put out by companies in line with the disclosure rules, many of the disclosure rules and all of the strongest ones require third-party verification at either a limited or a reasonable level for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And that's really important because, as we touched on, voluntary reporting of this has historically been inconsistent and unreliable, and we haven't really been sure if we can fully trust the information on emissions that has been given to us. But with this process of verification, which many companies do not currently do voluntarily, but by mandating that they have to seek third-party verification, we can be much more confident in the numbers that we get, that they're real, that they're accurate, and then we can compare them across companies with a lot more confidence. So that is one really big aspect of the disclosure rules to highlight, definitely.
Cool. Leila, there was another question about, it wasn't totally clear to me, but they were wondering about the risk of of the reporting, perhaps the dashboard, but I'm getting the sense it's more about the reporting being lost to changes from the Trump administration or federal government rulings. Like, is there any risk of these reports just like not happening due to changes at the federal level? Does that, yeah,
I think so. That's another great
yeah,
question. I think that there is a risk of these reports being that falling through the cracks, I guess would be the danger there. I think that that's a reasonable thing to think, just with everything that's going on, and also with the fact that there is some regulatory uncertainty around these rules, and so some companies might report sooner than others, and this stage sort of reporting. Um, but I do think that a lot of these rules have written into them specific standards and ways that this information should be reported. And many of the rules, including off the top of my head, the California rule, involve or include specific sort of like a specific framework for how this information can be also made accessible. So it's not just about reporting it, but it's also about reporting it in such a way as to make it accessible for the public. And I think that that's always a challenge, to make these complex, sort of heavy duty reports accessible to the public is always a little bit of a challenge. But I think, again, that's sort of like we hope where the dashboard can come in, and other frameworks also will be, other NGOs and organizations will be watching this too, and hopefully we can create that sense of accountability for the reporting actually being accessible to the public, for people actually to read it and for it to actually have some influence.
yeah. And I think I wanted to comment and bring up that you can see it really clearly in the dashboard materials you've created, Leila, that there's all these multiple jurisdictions are creating these requirements. So even if at the federal level there isn't enforcement or even a regulation for it, clearly the one in California is subject to California law, along with rulings in the EU and in other countries. So do you feel like, is there some strength in these rules coming from multiple jurisdictions and making sure that they actually come through?
Yes, that's a great point. I do feel like there's strength in numbers in this case. And also just to note that in our, not the most recent article, but the one before that, we did some research on how these rules will impact meat and dairy companies. And we did find that the major meat and dairy companies, the 15 major meat and dairy companies that we looked at, will be covered by 4 rules each on average. So yeah, we've got broad coverage of these disclosure rules on the major meat and dairy companies. And I think that's a great point. Like if there is some slippage, if there is some confusion at one jurisdiction level or another, I think it will sort of be caught by others. And that's a really positive aspect of the research that we've done so far.
Yeah, we've got a couple of really good questions here. Just a couple more minutes to get into a few of these. One that's right here, just a comment of this initiative is quite significant, I think, regarding the establishment of these disclosure regulations. Do you know much about how that started? Like where did the ball get rolling for these regulations to start at these different jurisdictions, or like on a general level?
Yeah. Well, I think, you could go as far back as the Paris Climate Agreement and show the whole timeline, because I think 2015 Paris Climate Agreement, that really started the ball rolling in a lot of ways in the climate space. I won't go into too much detail to give the full timeline, but 2015, and then I believe it was oh, don't quote me, but I believe it was 2021 that the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures um, was created, and created this framework, this standardized framework around how we should think about this, how we should be reporting this. And so since then, the United States was a leader until recently on climate-related disclosure rules. The SEC final rules were a big push. The EU, of course, is a leader on disclosure rules with the CSRD and other sustainability ESG frameworks that have been introduced. And so we're still watching. I mean, we know sort of the route that the SEC has gone, and so the US no longer is really a leader on this issue at the federal level. But California has stepped up now, and so I think we've seen leaders crop up, and then we've seen other jurisdictions follow. And yeah, I think you can trace it back. I mean, this is a long-standing thing. A lot of moving parts have come together to get us to where we are now. And I think now it's a great time to start looking to the future and start thinking about, well, let's plan for these rules to be implemented, because as I mentioned in the presentation, companies are planning for these rules to be implemented. So let's read the writing on the wall and plan for these things to happen, and then let's use them to sort of move forward toward reducing emissions. None of these rules call for the reduction in emissions, just the reporting, clear and standardized information. But what we really need is a reduction in emissions. And so let's use these rules to provide some accountability, corporate accountability to the climate space, and sort of bring ourselves, into that next stage.
Yeah, thank you, Leila. I think you hit the nail on the head with that this has been the work of years, decades to make this happen. And it's something we often emphasize at IATP, that the work that we're doing is not the work of a single year or administration. It takes time for these things to develop. And so we appreciate your support through the years of that as we continue to tackle these issues and raise awareness and produce this research, because it's not going to change in a year. It's not going to change in this administration. It didn't change in the last. So it takes a while for these things to get rolling. I think you really highlighted that quite well. I'm going to do just one more question here, and then we're going to wrap things up, folks. We'll do our best to get into some of these for you in a follow-up. But I think you sort of touched on this. Noel was wondering, do you think the dashboard might highlight dissonance in companies' behavior? Examples, some companies may invest in community-based reforestation projects, but a much larger investment focal action that I think in general they're trying to get at, do you think these resources in the dashboard might show how different corporations are tackling these issues and maybe making investments versus not making investments in climate reduction?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's one thing that the dashboard could highlight. I'd say in terms of the particular investments, that's fairly granular for the dashboard. But I do think that it will show sort of how different companies are responding to these rules, and it'll show differences in climate targets, and whether or not they're working towards those targets, if they're meeting those targets. It'll show their emissions over time. So a lot of really important information for people to play around with and interact with. And like I said, it's going to be updated on a regular basis. So it's going to continue to be relevant, and we can track it, which I think is going to provide a lot of really interesting information and research moving forward. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Highlighting the dissonance is an interesting way to view what the dashboard can do. I think that's true.
Yeah. And I'm rereading their question. And I think they may even want, like, from an individual company perspective, dissonance within that company, where they might be promoting and leveraging a climate reduction in one arm, and then on another arm doing stuff that's kind of shady or stuff that isn't supportive. Do you think we'll see some more of that clarity within a Nestle or within another organization, as they might do a little bit of good, a little bit of bad?
Sure. Yeah.
Or a lot
Some
of bad?
double speak, or like some
Yeah.
talking out both sides of your mouth kind of a thing. I definitely
Yeah.
think it could highlight that. I think that information is a fantastic disclosure is a fantastic weapon against greenwashing. And that is kind of in a nutshell what the dashboard, one of the things that the dashboard can provide. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Leila. Well, everyone, thank you so much for being here. We've had a wonderful conversation, and we're so glad you could join us. We hope you're able to make it for some of our future events. I'm just going to pull these up on the screen here for you. We've got 3 more events planned this session, this season, this spring. So we've actually made some pivots because we want to continue to make sure we're responding to events happening around us. So in April 15th, we're planning a webinar on trade and tariffs and how they're affecting the food systems, particularly from a US perspective. And at this time, we're planning in May to follow that up with a further discussion from an international perspective in Lens. Ultimately, we'll be having a event on June 16th here in Minneapolis. That'll be an in-person hybrid event of some social space, as well as some programming and material to engage with the details are still fleshing out about that. But if you're in the area in Minneapolis or want to travel to join us, we'd be very happy to have you. We'll have some more details coming out on that later. So once again, thank you so much, Leila. Thank you to all of you who were able to attend. Please join us again. We'll be sending out that follow-up. Invite your colleagues, invite your friends. And if you've got further questions about IATP, the work we do, you're welcome to message me. My name's Colin. Very happy to have you all back. And with that, we will call it a day. Thanks, everyone. Happy spring equinox. Happy beginning of spring, beginning of fall. And thank you so much for being here and for the work you do.